and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Millicent Walker. It is day 17 of Russia's assault, and explosions have been heard in Kyiv as Russian forces encroach on the Ukrainian capital, with intensified fighting to the northeast and the eastern part of the country. A number of major cities are under pressure as Russian strikes hit civilian structures. Ukrainians remain defiant, with several hundreds protesting in Melitopol against the arrest of the city's mayor by Russian forces. Fresh attempts to evacuate civilians from cities under siege in Ukraine are also being complicated by constant Russian shelling. Let's take a look at the key developments so far from day 17 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Fighting northwest of Kyiv continues as cities of Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Sumy and Mariupol are encircled by Russian troops. According to reports, Russian ground forces are 25 kilometers from the center of the Ukrainian capital. Rocket attacks destroyed a Ukrainian airbase and hit an ammunition depot in the Kyiv region. Sirens and explosions have also been heard in many cities across the country. Officials in Ukraine's second city of Kharkiv say at least one person was killed after residential buildings were hit by shelling. Ukrainian officials say Russia has again prevented civilian evacuations. Plans had been made to open up humanitarian corridors and get people out from cities under Russian attack, including Mariupol, where conditions are said to be critical. Authorities say that more than 1,500 people have been killed there, and those who are left face freezing temperatures. The city currently experiences limited to no power and little food and water. Meanwhile, hundreds of residents have taken to the streets of the southeastern city of Melitopol to protest against the abduction of its mayor by Russian forces. In his latest video address, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky demanded the mayor's release. He also revealed that 1,300 Ukrainian troops have died in the conflict so far, and says Russia is sending new forces to Ukraine after suffering what Zelensky describes as Moscow's biggest losses in decades.
I know that my colleagues, the Prime Minister...
The UK has sent 6 more plane loads of medical aid and equipment to Ukraine, as Health Secretary Sajid Javid accuses Russia of war crimes in attacking medical facilities.
This is a war started by Russia, completely unprovoked, completely unjustified, and what we are seeing from Russia, especially the attacks on health facilities, where the WHO have reported over, I think, 25 health facilities, including hospitals, have been targeted or hit for whatever reason, completely unacceptable reasons, by Russian forces. I mean, this is a war crime, and Russia will pay for the crimes that it is carrying out in Ukraine today.
The leaders of France and Germany have again held another round of phone talks with Russia's President Vladimir Putin. They called on the Russian president to declare an immediate ceasefire. The French president's office said after the meeting that Russian President Vladimir Putin showed no willingness to end the war. The conflict has now sent 2.5 million Ukrainians fleeing to neighboring countries.
And the situation, really, I can't speak without tears. I'm sorry, but I'm really sorry for my country, and nobody could expect this, really. This is awfully awful things. They're bombing Kharkov, they're bombing Nikolaev. It's only 120 kilometers from Odessa, and it's painful inside.
Poland says more than 1.6 million people have fled there, while Moldova says it has reached a breaking point in its ability to cope with refugees. Meanwhile, for another weekend, thousands have taken to the streets to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And Italian police have seized a super yacht from Russian billionaire Andriy Melnichenko, a few days after the businessman was placed on an EU sanctions list following Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
As Russian forces surround the city with troops and artillery, just kilometers away, Ukraine's civilian fighters and residents in the capital are preparing for a major attack. Air raid sirens have rang out across the capital region as rocket barrages sent residents running for shelter. Well, joining us now is Mr. John Essing, a lawyer and an international expert in counterterrorism and conflict resolution. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me. Good evening.
Good evening. This invasion has been going on for over 2 weeks now. The White House calls the Russian president's actions an escalation without an end game. Is this the case? What do you think Russia's motive and end game is here?
There's certainly an end game, and Putin knows exactly what he's doing. And there's always been one end game from after the Second World War in 1948. The West established a rules-based international order, driven especially by the United States. And what Russia is trying to do is substitute that rules-based order for an alternative that suits its totalitarian repressive order to form a new world order. So this is just a foundation to build up to that, so that that order can be substituted for what has been driving international relations for the last 80 years. That's the same thing that China is trying to do, and to a lesser extent, North Korea and Iran.
But when Russia was asked if it would go beyond Ukraine during a meeting, I believe in Antalya, the foreign minister said that no, but they've always said the reason why they are invading Ukraine, and that is about the special operation denazifying and demilitarizing the country.
Yeah, I've heard that as well, but that's just an excuse. Russia's intentions have never changed since 1948, and they wouldn't change. The rules-based order is democratic. It's secular liberalism, so it doesn't suit any authoritarian repressive regime like Russia. So what it's trying to do is leverage its power regionally, because that's where it has a bit of leverage. It wants to co-opt some of the satellite states that belong to the former USSR. When it has enough power in the region, then it'll posture itself on the international stage to see if it can compete with the United States and China. Because remember, it's one of the tripartite that make up the great power competition. The other countries are China and the US. And despite Russia being in that bracket, it's far below the par compared to the US and China. So this is its own. This is the background to put it at the highest level, so he can compete with those two powers. So the idea has always been to recreate the Russian Empire, the former Mother Russia, so he can compete with the other two great powers.
There's been talks recently about chemical weapons. Yesterday, that was the focus of the UN Security Council meeting, where on the one hand, we saw Russia accusing the US of biological weapons activities, and the US in turn saying the claims are a false flag to justify Russia's potential use of similar weapons against Ukraine. What do you make of this?
Yeah, it looks like a false flag, and it's a page straight out of Russia's playbook. But I don't think it'll get to a point where Russia deploys chemical weapons, because you can't silo those kinds of the effect from those kinds of deployments. You can't. It's not sterile, and because you have many NATO countries in proximity to Ukraine, if he does that and there's an accident or mistake where one of the NATO parts NATO countries becomes a victim, then that legitimizes NATO under Article 5 to get into confrontation with Russia directly. And Russia has been doing everything to avoid that, despite its rhetoric, doesn't want NATO in the war. So he'll do everything to avoid that. So the rhetoric is bigger for two reasons. One, it's as a deterrent to keep the West out of the war. And secondly, it's a uniquely curated narrative its constituents back in Russia because they've been fed disinformation. They don't actually know what's going on in Ukraine. But when that is eventually unraveled, he'll lose a lot of political capital domestically, like he's lost internationally. So that narrative is to feed his constituents back home and to deter NATO from getting involved any further than it already has in Ukraine.
Last week, the threat was over nuclear weapons. Some have said this war isn't going according to Russia's president's plan and he's getting desperate. Do you agree with this? And is there a possibility of it deploying nuclear weapons?
He is certainly getting desperate because the rules of engagement he initially deployed to invade Ukraine were the wrong ones. He should never have done that. But they worked in Georgia in 2008. They worked in the Donbass region in 2014, and they've worked in northern Syria for about 10 years. So he just thought, if it's worked in the past, I might as well deploy it. But there are different rules of engagement for asymmetric warfare than there are for conventional warfare. And despite Russia having overwhelming superior conventional capabilities, it's not been able to make very much gains in Ukraine because he needed to deploy a different set of rules of engagement. So he's desperate, but I don't think, for the same reasons I made with chemical weapons, I don't think he'll deploy nuclear weapons because that'll be too dangerous and it'll reach a tipping point. So that'll be the catalyst for NATO to join the war. And he wants to do everything to keep NATO out of it because if he's struggling just with Ukraine, despite the support from NATO, if NATO joins it, that'll finish him. So I don't think that's the case.
If Russia takes control of the whole of Ukraine, what would be the implications and perhaps the likely response from NATO and the US?
To begin with, I don't think Russia will ever be able to take all of Ukraine because its forces are stretched at the moment. It doesn't have enough manpower to do that. It doesn't have enough equipment either. If it's going to do that, it has to deploy from Russia, and it hasn't got the time to do that. But let's assume it did. Then I don't think that will compel NATO to join the war because Ukraine is doing very well as it is, and it would have done better if it had a lot more proximity to Russian forces. I'm going to say something that might sound ironical. I think for Ukraine to win this war, it'll have to allow Russia to invade it, Russia is quite close and there's enough proximity between the forces because this is basically asymmetric warfare. This is hybridized insurgency, and the closer Russia gets to Ukraine, the higher the chances of it losing the war. It may win the battle by invading Ukraine, but it'll certainly lose the war because it doesn't have what it takes to win it.
And of course, NATO's posture, this is despite Ukrainian's president's call for declaration of a no-fly zone. That would definitely not be happening. But tell us your thoughts about NATO's angle of diplomatic solution.
NATO doesn't have, you can't negotiate with a revisionist like Russia. This has been an endgame from 1948, and it's never going to change. Putin might not succeed with it, but he'll lay the foundations for the next leader because he's about, I think he's 69 or 70, so he's on his way out. He knows that, but he wants to leave a legacy for at least leaving a foundation, so whoever comes in can take off from where he stops. Russia understands the Anglo-Saxon mindset, the Western mindset. Westerners tend to see international agreements as mercantile transactions with enforcement mechanisms like your sales contract, the basic contract. But the Russians they never see agreements that way. That's why we've seen lots of broken agreements going back, going back
many years,
maybe 80 years. several years, long before now. Lots of broken agreements because they understand the mindset of the West. If they agree, if Russia ever engages in anything to discuss an agreement or negotiate an agreement, it's to buy time for an agenda, or it's to retool it to frustrate the agreement so that you never get to the objective it was meant to achieve in the first place. So if the West is engaging in an agreement, it should have that in mind and buy time to look for alternatives as well, just like Russia will do. But Russia does not have any intentions of keeping any agreement. Even when it negotiates for an agreement, it's to buy time so it can, like what happened a few days ago. It called for negotiations with Ukraine, so they could open a corridor, a humanitarian corridor to get the civilians out. But it started bombing the corridor while that was still in force. So that just demonstrates what its intention was in the first place. It never keeps an agreement, and it's not going to be keeping one now.
So you think that all the negotiations that are ongoing will amount to nothing?
It's a complete waste of time, and I think that even those of some of the Westerners negotiating know that, because that is how Russia is. Russia never, if it ever keeps an agreement, it's on its own terms, and Ukraine will rather die than exchange a piece of their real estate for Russia. They wouldn't. It wouldn't work.
Tell us, paint a picture of what you think the future is, because it's almost like you're painting a very bleak picture, most especially for Ukrainians who are really at the receiving end of this war.
I think what we'll have is an intractable, protracted, long-term war. Russia is going to win the battle when it gets into Ukraine, but the war will begin the day Russia invades Ukraine, because that will transition for Russia from being a conventional warfare to Ukraine to being a asymmetry or hybridized insurgency, where you don't need the power of Russia to win the war. What Russia should have done to begin with is ask basic questions. Who is my enemy? What are their tactics and strategies? Where is the arena of contestation? How equipped am I? How adept am I to that terrain? And what do I do what constitutes success? Do I degrade their capabilities to contain them, or do I go for broke and go for a decisive victory? That's what they went for. They went for the latter and they failed. So that's why I said what I said in the beginning. When there is more proximity between the Russian troops and the Ukrainian troops, the Ukrainians will have a better opportunity to win the war. But that can only happen when Russia invades Ukraine.
And from that end, if Ukraine wins the war, what happens?
If it wins the war, it kicks Russia out. Russia will lose all credibility. It'll lose all of its political leverage. It'll lose all of its economic capital. It's already doing that. And with the world backing Ukraine, it'll be the end of Russia as we know it. But that is going to take a lot of time, and it is. I must say this. I must stress this. It is going to cost a lot of Ukrainian lives, unfortunately.
Extremely unfortunate. Well, we'd like to thank you, appreciate you spending time with us on the program and your expertise. Mr. John Essing is a lawyer, international expert in counterterrorism and conflict resolution. Many thanks for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
As the war escalates, about 23 Nigerian students at Kherson State Maritime Academy are calling for help from the federal government to urge Russian authorities to declare a ceasefire in the city so they can be safely evacuated. The port city of Kherson in southern Ukraine has been under occupation by Russian troops since the first days of the war. The Nigerian students say they have spent about 15 days sleeping in bomb basements as Russia's offensive continues. According to them, many are unwell amid freezing temperatures, and they are unable to get access to medicines, and food is running low.
Since this place has been captured, nobody's doing anything to evacuate us from here. Please, we want to go home. Everybody is cold. If we're in a normal life, we have heaters in our home. But in case of war, we are stuck underground, where there's no heater. Please, talk to the mayor of Kherson. Talk to the people of Russia. Let them come in agreement so that there will be ceasefire for us to get a green corridor. Please, I plead with you. We don't have provisions anymore.
Me and some couple of guys are stuck in Kherson, in Ukraine. And we are like about 6 that are not feeling fine, currently not feeling fine because of the weather. And there's no food actually to eat right now. Everything is just, we are in a critical condition. So we're calling on the Nigerian government to at least come to a rescue, because the situation in Kherson right now, it's really crazy.
An SOS there from Nigerian students who are in Kherson. Well, as with the rest of the world, Russia's invasion of Ukraine February 24 is casting a long shadow across Africa. Despite the geographical distance, there are important ties between Ukraine and Africa, including more than 8,000 Moroccans and 4,000 Nigerians studying in Ukraine, and over $4 billion in exports from Ukraine to Africa. As Russia's invasion of Ukraine escalates, Moscow's growing influence in Africa has led to different responses among the continent's leaders. Heads of state from around the world, including many from Africa, have lambasted the Russian attack, with a number of African countries voting in favor of a UN resolution condemning Russia's offensive. However, a number of countries have been publicly reluctant to denounce Moscow. One of them is South Africa. President Cyril Ramaphosa said on Friday that he has been asked to help mediate peace between Russia and Ukraine after having spoken to his counterparts, Vladimir Putin. But some analysts are questioning whether South Africa's ties to Russia could impact its neutrality. Well, for more on this, we're being joined by security and global affairs analyst Confidence Makari. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me once again.
Confidence, before we get on with Africa's position, I'd like to get your thoughts on the kind of situation you just heard from. And this is Kherson, the Nigerian students who are in Kherson and who are calling for the federal government's help.
Yeah, well, it's very sad that more than 2 weeks after the war started, we still haven't gotten our students out. I saw an update on Twitter the other day when there was an announcement that the Air Peace plane who went to rescue the students then returned empty-handed after the first and second batches of students were rescued. And yes, I understand the fact that getting to a green corridor to get students out has been quite difficult because of the violation of ceasefire between the Russians and the Ukrainians. But it's still very sad that after the last mission which Air Peace went and came back, there's not been any word from the Nigerian government as regards the rescue of students, while countries like India, China, and several other countries are still trying to rescue their own students. So it's very, very sad that it is not a welcoming development.
Especially for those in Kherson, where Russia is controlling at the moment. But let's come back to talking about the continent. Were you surprised about the statement from South African leader saying that his country has been asked to mediate in this war?
No, it's not entirely surprising. South Africa is a member of BRICS. BRICS is a collection of countries, economically aligned countries such as Brazil, Russia, South Africa, and I think I don't really remember the other countries that are part of it. Extensive amount of ties with Russia. So it's super interesting. And first of all, you could see it from the event that the more many countries are less willing to outrightly condemn Russia's actions, the more Russia has been open and willing to communicate with them. So you are seeing the same thing with people in countries like South Africa, with Turkey, with Israel, and the rest of them. Russia's decision to hold mediation in Minsk, in Belarus, has not gone down well with the Ukrainians. So even the Turkish experiment has largely failed. And so Russia has been open to other ideas, such as Israel and South Africa. So it's not entirely shocking, it's not entirely surprising that South Africa is actually trying to take the place of a mediator in this conflict. I mean, if possible, we should welcome such decision.
Also, the refusal by some African countries to condemn this war has generated some criticism. Some analysts have raised issues of territorial integrity, tying Russia's invasion of Ukraine to colonial domination of African states. Do you think that this puts countries like South Africa, who abstained from the UN votes, on the wrong side of history?
No, actually not. I mean, Africa's interest in this conflict, it's simply economic. And it is better for us to channel our direction, our energy to where it actually favors us more than to go on a spurious amount of condemnation, which does not augur well for any of the parties. For people tying this thing to colonialism, they're not entirely wrong. There are arguments that Russia has not colonized or invaded any country in Africa, and were even instrumental to decolonization efforts by the countries by the continent's independence leaders. So there is merit to those arguments, but we're living in vastly different times now. All business, all relations between many of these countries have moved away from the moral and idealistic part into a business and should I say, a realpolitik kind of environment where other countries are looking out for their interests. And so for the majority of the countries who abstained from the condemnation of Russia in the United Nations General Assembly last week, they have valuable reasons for doing so. But I take exception to actions from countries like Nigeria and Kenya, who voted to condemn. They could take a leaf from a country like South Africa, who initially condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but initially and then chose to walk a fine line back to suing for peace and choosing to abstain from United Nations General Assembly votes. But for Africa, this is a conflict, this is a war that is happening thousands and thousands of miles away from its territory. So the best we could do is to curate its interest, to look out for its interest in the conflict and make sure that it is not taking sides in whatever way.
How do you think Nigeria's role and that decision at the UN Council, how do you think it affects us?
Well, we should look at it from Nigeria's ties with Russia. Of course, certainly it does not augur well for the two countries. Nigeria and Russia signed a couple of defense agreements during the Russia-Africa Summit in Sochi in 2019. There were a couple of other ones that were supposed to be signed during the second Russia-Africa Summit towards the end of the year, and so it barely makes sense, for such an agreement. But on the other hand, you could also look at what Nigeria stands to benefit in this conflict. Since the war, we have seen energy shortages in Europe. Russia was the #1 gas supplier to many countries in Western Europe. We had the Nord Stream 1 project, and then we currently have the Nord Stream 2 project, which supplies gas directly from Russia to Germany, which has now been suspended because of the war as part of sanctions to influence Russia's actions to pull out. But Nigeria currently has an agreement which is signed with Niger Republic and Algeria to ship liquefied natural gas, the Trans-Saharan pipeline to Europe. Nigeria is already supplying some European countries with liquefied natural gas. And so to some extent, you could say that it has an influence in condemning, in seeing that the war continues for as long as it can. But the bizarre nature in which it went ahead to condemn Russia is quite inconsistent with some of its gains that are supposed to be made, especially in seeing that the conflict continues, so that Nigeria is going to get more revenue from its gas exports to Europe. On the surface, it doesn't look well. It doesn't look good. It doesn't go well for Nigeria's relations with Russia. I do hope that policymakers at the Nigerian Foreign Mission and Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually know what exactly they are doing and why they actually have to take such a bizarre stance.
But also, as the war rages, another issue that has been raised by Western leaders is the presence of Russian mercenaries, Wagner Group in Africa. Do you think this is something we need to be worried about?
Russian mercenaries have been in Africa long before the conflicts in Ukraine broke out. The Wagner Group were first spotted in places like Libya, where Russia tried to gain a foothold into the Mediterranean, trying to, as part of its attempts to channel or to private power to the Middle East. And so Libya was the first testing ground for the Wagner Group. and then they expanded to places in hinterland Africa, such as Mozambique, and then the Central African Republic, which they were called in to stop the advance of Anti-Saleka and Anti-Balaka movements into the capital. So currently they're in Mali, which, of course, the government of Assimi Goïta called them in for protection and to rescue to help in counter-terrorism efforts. But we all know why the Wagner Group is in Mali, for instance. It's definitely not to protect the country from terrorists. It's basically it rules as regime protection. There is if the French military with Operation Barkhane, Operation Takuba, and the might of several European powers could not dislodge jihadist terrorists from Mali, there's hardly so much that or so little that the Wagner Group can do. But in the current context of the conflict, I think we should be a lot more wary if the conflict in Ukraine progresses so badly for the Russian government that its military cannot keep up with its objectives, and then it has to withdraw the Wagner Group. And I hate to say this, if you withdraw the Wagner Group from a country like Mali, whose government heavily depends on it for regime security, it's kind of an opening to a Pandora box of a lot of competing interests, terror groups competing for control with the Malian military, as well as several other interest groups that might try to exploit the vacuum that has been created by the exit of the Wagner Group, which, like I have said earlier, was called in to protect the Malian regime. And so we might be looking at a full-blown insurgency in not just the hinterlands or the northern part of Mali, where the Tuareg rebels have been operating since 2012, but right at the center of the Malian government itself in Bamako. So I think it's kind of an insurgency or it's kind of a conflict rather that not only the Malian government cannot afford right now, but also the Nigerian government being the regional hegemony, the economic community of West African states, ECOWAS.
So quite a tricky situation. But looking at how everything is going, how would you say that African leaders or countries in Africa, the governments, should respond to this conflict, Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
I think a refrain from condemnation is necessary. Yes, you could sue for peace, you could call the other parties to come to a negotiating table, but I will not kid you by saying that a negotiation is easy to come by. I mean, even a president like Emmanuel Macron of France has been roundly condemned the past week for suggesting that a Finlandization of Ukraine is on the table. I mean, the comment did not go down well in Ukraine, saying that they want the same situation that happened with Finland at the onset of the Second World War to happen to Ukraine, where its neutrality is not entirely a neutral position, but subject to the whims and the caprices of the Soviet Union. And so I will not kid you to say that negotiation is easy. So far, the negotiations have not really gone well. Ceasefires have been agreed upon and violated at will, and both sides are accusing the other party for violating it. For Africa, our interests are very simple. The number one gambit is to get our students out. It's very heartbreaking seeing the video from Nigerian students talking person and some others in Sumi. So our priorities right now should be able to get our students out of harm's way. When you get them out of harm's way, then we try to funnel our interests. What exactly are our interests in the conflict? If they're economic, if they're political, how exactly should we respond? Who favors us more? Are we going to keep following the West in their attempt to gather more international sympathy for the anti-Russian brigade, or we are going to toe the Russian line to it? If we're going to toe the Russian line, there are repercussions concerning state conflict and the encroachment of state territoriality and sovereignty. These are issues that all countries on the continent must have to come to terms with. And thankfully, we have a channel like the African Union and several other regional organizations that we can be able to advocate this interest. But for me personally, I would say that any form of condemnation for both sides of the conflict is not entirely right. What we should be doing right now as a continent is to be condemning racist actions that have been attributed to Ukrainian and Polish border officials in their treatment of African refugees in their country.
Yes, indeed. Security and Global Affairs Analyst Confidence Makari, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me once again.
And more US soldiers have been deployed to Europe. This is Friday now to assist NATO allies amid the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. Some 130 soldiers stationed at Fort Stewart in Georgia bumped fists with their leaders as they departed from Hunter Airfield, including Captain Sarah Seekins. Major General Charlie Costanza said the soldiers were told to prepare for a 6-month mission. Costanza added that he felt proud watching the soldiers board the plane, but also understood that it wasn't easy for them to leave their families. The soldiers are from the B Company, 87th Division Sustainment Support Battalion, 3rd Division Sustainment Brigade. The U.S. Army said the soldiers' mission included reassuring NATO allies and deterring Russian aggression. Refugees from Ukraine sought shelter and help at temporary reception centers in Poland's southeast today, as governments and volunteers struggle to find shelter for nearly 2.6 million people who have fled Russia's invasion so far. Poland has received most of them, but hundreds of thousands have also crossed to EU member states like Slovakia, Hungary and Romania, as well as to non-EU Moldova in the past 2 weeks. Many arrivals are seeking to travel on elsewhere. At a town centre in the town, transportation offers were written on signs, and people coming to help refugees were on the ground. Danish volunteer Hans Otto Sorensen said he had come the day before and was hoping to take up 100 people on a bus back to Denmark. Mohammed Salem, a Libyan man living in Kyiv with his Ukrainian wife, said the situation in the capital, he hopes that the fighting would stop soon.
Help the people who are in this big need, who are the victims of this catastrophe which is going on in Ukraine. We feel it as our human responsibility to help them. And what we are doing is we are transporting them to Denmark, where we have accommodation for them, and they'll be allowed to stay as long as they want. And we will also see that they can get a job if they want, and so on. So we are here completely as private people, left Denmark yesterday afternoon, and has come here to pick up around 100 people and bring them back to Denmark.
It's a very bad feeling because it's a very bad situation there, and all people want to go out because there is more bomb and there is bad situation for all people. I hope it's will be good everything soon. But seriously, it's a very bad situation for people that stay there.
Staying with Poland, its economic minister says Ukraine is facing a humanitarian crisis and urgently needs supplies of food and medicine to be brought into the country. Yulia Seridenko at a train station in Poland, one of the main ports of entry for people fleeing Russia's invasion, also called for tougher sanctions on Russia. Ukrainian officials said on Saturday heavy shelling and threats of Russian air attacks were endangering attempted evacuations of desperate civilians from encircled towns and cities elsewhere. Nearly 2.6 million, mostly women and children, have fled to neighboring countries.
We are facing humanitarian crisis right now, so that's why we are talking with the government and with the government of EU, and we're asking for help for a humanitarian aid that might go to Ukraine. That's why we're here. We're trying to build a proper logistic route, so to get it very quickly and to provide people with all necessary, with the water, with the food, with the medicine. So that's why we're also asking once again, if you have this opportunity to help Ukraine right now, we need, first of all, its top priority is, I think, that for food products. The second one is the medicine, of course. When weapon is another track, and I don't want to discuss it right here. I think that this sanction is not enough. It should be more. Because, you know, every day our people, they are dying, children dying. We have a humanitarian crisis in several cities. People lack of water, lack of food, and that's why just we actually we have, you know, we don't have weeks or months. And that's why we need this assistance right now. We need your help today, and we really appreciate if you can, you know, make this sanction more effective against Russia. We're checking the situation with our Ukrainian people that live country for the last 2 weeks, and we would like to check the conditions here, and we will also would like to persuade people that we are keeping fighting, and we hope that we will win. And for all these people here in Poland, we would like to persuade them that they will have opportunity to return back home, and we will make everything to create conditions and to make the full reconstruction of the country and to fight against Russia. So
Ukraine's foreign minister says the country is ready to negotiate to end the war started by Russia more than 2 weeks ago, but would not surrender or accept any ultimatums. Speaking at a virtual event organized by the non-partisan non-profit organization Renew Democracy Initiative, Kuleba says civilian lives will be saved if Ukraine had fighter jets and more attack planes to destroy large military columns. He adds that he believes the war would likely end if Russian President Vladimir Putin were removed from power.
It doesn't exclude the track of diplomacy and the need to talk and to find solutions, but as President Zelensky said on a number of occasions, we are ready to negotiate, but we are not going to accept any ultimatums and surrender. If we had more planes, we would have been able to save many more human lives, mainly civilian lives, because the main striking force of Russia is in the air, and they indiscriminately choose to attack civilian infrastructure and kill our civilians. I believe that the removal of President Putin will be enough to stop the war, but the restoration of peace and security in the Euro-Atlantic space will also require not only the removal of Putin, but the deputinization of Russia. Putin is not just a person, it's a system. And Russia must be deputinized.
Since the invasion, Western countries have swiftly moved to isolate Russia from the global financial system. US President Joe Biden opened a new attack on Russia's economy earlier on Friday, joining with allies to hit Moscow on trade and shut down development funds, announcing a ban on imports. The European Union announced it will ban the export of its luxury goods to Russia in order to deal a blow to the Russian elite. Taken in coordination with G7 countries, which includes the UK, the US, Canada and Japan, the package also includes denying Russia the status of most favored nation in their respective markets. Russia has become the world's most sanctioned country, with over 5,000 sanctions so far. But is this enough to deter Russia? How much impact will these sanctions have? Well, joining us to discuss this is an international affairs expert, Mr. Paul Ejime. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me, Millicent.
Welcome. Yesterday, US President announced fresh sanctions, which includes revoking Russia's preferred trade status and pushing to suspend normal trade relations with the country. How significant is this move, and what impact is it likely to have on Russia?
Well, all the sanctions put together, you have talked about them about 5,000, and that makes Russia in history. That is the most sanctioned nation. You will think that the idea is to squeeze and destroy the Russian economy. But is that the whole idea? The sanctions will also have effect across the world, not just the report that preceded this interview. You had Poland complaining that they also needed help to be able to take the amount of refugees that are now flowing into that country. Other neighboring countries are facing the same. It is not about sanctions. They are treating this conflict as if it's about economy. Remember, they went there because Russia invaded Ukraine, something that is political. But now they are using these economic factors, sanctions, to thinking that alone will be able to make Putin to, what will Putin do? No, but much is not being talked about in terms of the dialogue and negotiation. It's only the UN Secretary General that is talking about it, Sanctions will hurt not just Russians, for 145 million of them. It will hurt 43 million Ukrainians. It will also hurt millions of neighboring countries, and even they will have reverberative effect across the globe, even to Africa. You know, because they will now tell you the amount of cooperation that Africans used to have will be diminished. It will be reduced. And you see President Biden talking about now denying Russia the preferential, free trade. Africa also has to watch it. Remember, we have the AGAL, African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is ending in 2025. If the Western world can wake up one morning and then begin to, without due process, begin to cut off countries, who tells you that they cannot use the same thing against Africa? So that is the reason this unilateral, inconsistent, and then hypocritical kind of sanctions are becoming too much. You cannot use the disease. I think the treatment is getting worse than the disease. I think they should now look at negotiation and how to bring, because at the end of the day, even after killing everybody, you still have to come to the table. So why don't you do that now?
We hope it doesn't get to that. Putin has called the Western economic sanctions on Russia akin to a declaration of war. But if sanctions are not enough, and if my earlier guest today is saying negotiations will not work, what then?
I think sanctions alone will not either. It has to come with, remember, this is the same Western countries. History has a way of throwing out certain things. When it was apartheid South Africa, remember Britain under Thatcher told us that sanctions don't work. US companies were doing business with South Africa then. Suddenly, they have discovered that sanction alone can work. No, it can work. It has to be complemented by actions, certain actions, maybe behind the scenes. Let countries engage. Those who can, that Putin can listen to, they should be able to come together and bring safe face. Now, rigidity cannot do it. We need some level of flexibility.
Thank you so much, International Affairs expert. Always a pleasure having you join us on the program. Mr. Paul Ejime, many thanks and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for having me.
And before we go, let's take a look at the key events from today. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky tells a news conference that over 1,000 Ukrainian troops have died in the conflict so far. He says that around 500 to 600 Russian troops surrendered to Ukrainian forces, and that was on Friday. A military airfield south of Kyiv is hit by missiles, as reports suggest the bulk of Russian forces are just 25 kilometers from the city. French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz urged Russian President Vladimir Putin to agree to a ceasefire. But according to French office, he is not agreeing to that in terms of the body language. People in the city of Mariupol are said to be enduring freezing temperatures with no power and little food and water. Also, Russia has accused Ukraine of rejecting nearly all its offers to provide humanitarian corridors out of flashpoint towns. And there you have it. You've caught up on events, key events on day 17, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's our program this evening. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Wonka. Stay safe.